Showing David Deutsch, that physicist in Britain. I watch him every now and then. And so I don't want to be recording David Deutsch as part of my show. Showing David Deutsch, that physicist in Britain. What is happening? It's doing it again. What is happening? What?
Well, you're recording, right?
No, I don't want it to go live showing David Deutsch or some other show. Hold on. Now let me start. Okay, now it says it's going on YouTube. This meeting is being, I want to see what I'm showing. Well, okay, I am recording it. So if it is doing what I'm afraid it may be doing, recording some other show, showing some other show on YouTube, well, that's not so bad so long as I know I'm recording this, because I can fix it then, but I don't like the idea, obviously. Anyway, let's assume that it's okay, and because I don't see exactly what happened. It's going to YouTube. Okay. Okay, we're gonna pretend that there's nothing weird happening, and get my camera mic over here, and then I'll introduce you. Okay.
Okay, what I was watching now is off. It's gone.
All right. What are you seeing now?
Right now I'm looking at Trump behind bars or something. But you looking up and talking to yourself was live, but now that's gone. So I'm on YouTube. Let me see if oh no, this is let me get rid of this. I could replay that if I wanted to, but I want to kill that. I don't know how to find your
all right, channel. Look, I think what I don't want to do is inconvenient for everybody. But that would be the thing to, because it would end this, recording. It says the meeting is being live streamed, but it's showing it's somebody else's program, right? That's being recorded as mine. Is that what you're seeing?
I just found your channel, but I'm not seeing anything live.
It says it's live on YouTube, but I don't. There's something really wrong, I think, because what happened, definitely, my face went off and something else replaced it. It was David Deutsch in UK, and I've never had that happen before. And I've done 600. This is 610 or 11 now.
So if I want to find you, would I look for Meta, Spencer, or would I look for Saving the World, or what should I look for?
Go to YouTube and look for To Save the World. And see if you see me.
To Dave, that's not going to work. To Save the World. Okay, let's see what happens. So what comes up is not you. Well, at the bottom of my screen, it shows you.
It does?
But I think it was the previous one. It's not.
Yeah, okay. I can't do this without ending our program. All right, I'm going to go ahead because I know I'm recording what we're really doing, and whatever is showing up on YouTube, I can take it down and replace it with the edited version of this. But it shouldn't, it's not nice to have to do that, but let's go ahead, okay? All right. Okay, here we go. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. today we're going to talk with people who are very much activists and very much engaged in trying to save the world in terms of the environment and especially climate. I have three wonderful activist leaders here, and we're going to have a conversation about how we can maybe influence public opinion, or at least have some influence in certain communities that we belong to. In California is Suzanne Reed, who is clearly a climate activist, but she's retired from other positions in government. She was a legislative assistant for Joseph Biden. She was the chief of staff of the legislature in California, I believe. She's going to correct me if I got all this wrong, but she's mostly now working on environmental and climate issues. And I understand she has a horse. So we will have a conversation about her interests and how all of us have common overlapping concerns about how we're going to change public opinion in the direction it needs to go. I don't know where Doug Grant is, but I've had several conversations lately with Doug Grant, who also has done work in industry mostly, but also regulating energy policies before his retirement. And he's been very involved with an organization that Suzanne Reed also co-founded, the Healthy Planet Action Coalition, I believe it's called, unless I'm misstating it. And this is a group of people who are clearly concerned about climate and who know a lot more than I do. I belong to it, but I don't always listen because it's a little over my head sometimes. They're scientists. And in Canada, not close to me, but farther north, is Lawrence Martin, who's been on my show several times in the past, bless his heart, good-hearted, willing person. And he is a leader of the Cree community. He began, I think his fame began when he was especially concerned about being a singer. He was a singer that got lots of awards for his music, and then became the mayor of a couple of Ontario towns, and then became the Grand Chief of the Muskogowuk Council, if I'm not mistaken, and now is running a project to handle environmental and climate issues in the Canadian North on behalf of or with the Indigenous people living in the area. Good morning, all of you. And Lawrence, I want to start with you because I've been trying to keep from telling people about your project. You told me to not disclose much. You're doing things that is a big deal when it happens, but it's not public yet. So I have not shared anything about it much to either of these people, but now you've been talking about it, and I think you can be a little bit more public. Will you tell us a little bit, or as much as you can, about what your grand plan is and why we should be so excited as I am about it?
All right. I'm sorry to be so secretive.
Huh?
But basically what we're doing is very public. We're working up in James Bay and Hudson Bay, Northern Canada. And a few years ago, we signed a memorandum of understanding with Parks Canada to look at doing a feasibility study for the establishment of a national marine conservation area in both James Bay and Hudson Bay on the western side, which covers about 96,000 square kilometers of water. So we started that process, and in the MOU we signed with Canada, we agreed that it would be Indigenous led. So we, as Indigenous people, would have the opportunity to express how this study should be run and what we feel needs to be protected in the waters. And we carried out the study in the last couple of years, and of course confirmed that we do have a lot of belugas here in James Bay and Hudson Bay, about 40,000 of them. And then we have polar bears that are here, which is about over 2,000 of them. And we have seals, and we have all kinds of fish, different species of fish. And it's also an area where the migratory birds come from the US and Mexico and South America to come and nest and feed, and then they leave the area. So it's we as Cree people, we know it from that perspective as a birthing place for these birds. And we work with various agencies across US and Canada, and one of them is Audubon National Society in the US, where they've been able to keep a lot of the studies and shared the information with us. And they've counted like 3 to 5 billion birds leave this area in the fall to migrate south. So it's a very significant area for them and for us, because we rely on a lot of those migratory birds for food purposes, especially with the ducks and the Canada geese and the snow geese. Not so much on the shorebirds or on the songbirds, but definitely when you put all those birds together, we have that many that fly south. And then we also been able to count the caribou that come out to the shoreline. Thousands of those species, and black bears and moose and all kinds of different animals. So the study shows that the area is definitely, in favor of being designated as a national marine conservation area. And this is where I stopped my story on that, because now we're about to enter negotiations with Parks Canada on how much of the area will actually be protected. We feel the 96,000 square kilometers is appropriate, because that's our traditional territory as Cree people. And
I'm sorry, this goes, you've got Hudson Bay and James Bay in this larger area, and you're talking about land territory on both sides of both those bodies of water, or where?
no, I'm just talking about the water.
Okay.
Just James Bay and Hudson Bay water on the western side. And because in talking to Canada about it directly, they have the jurisdiction over those waters. And so that's why we're dealing with them directly. And in the course of the feasibility study, our people pointed out that the polar bears and many of these species of wildlife also use the land. They don't just use the water. So therefore, we must add another 20-kilometer buffer zone along the shoreline, all the way from the Quebec border, all the way up to the Manitoba border, which is another 1,200 kilometers altogether in distance. So when it comes to land, this is where we need now to go and speak to Ontario. Ontario has a jurisdiction for the land. So now we have to incorporate Ontario into those discussions. And again, those discussions are about to start, and the negotiations are about to start. So therefore, I can't go too much further on the details of that part. But that's basically the overall. And we also were given some funds from Canada, or at least committed funds from Canada, under the PFP project. PFP stands for Project Financing for Permanence. That was announced on December 7th, 2022, where Canada committed to 800 million across the country for 4 groups. Mushkegowuk is one of them. The Inuit to the north of us is the other group, and the Northwest Territory First Nations, and the folks out in British Columbia. So us 4 groups are going to be able to divide that money up and use it to do our conservation planning on the land side, the terrestrial side. So that's what we're now doing. We've been working on the feasibility of that, identifying the peatlands that we have. Like, we have a huge peatland sector in our territory, which is about say 130, 140 square kilometers of it, which is quite huge, about the size of California, say. So that area is huge, and it's actually is the second largest carbon sink in the world. It's the largest in North America. So we feel very compelled to protect it, but there are some mines that are being proposed in the territory. So we're having discussions with those mining companies for any kind of mitigation plans that would be required to ensure that the land is protected as best as we can if there's going to be any mining or any kind of industrial activity taking place. So we're about to also start negotiations on that component on the terrestrial side with Canada and with Ontario, and keeping the mining operations and plans in mind as we move forward. So we're hoping to finish these negotiations in about a year or so. And we have a 10-year implementation. So whatever we agree to, there will be a 10-year implementation. On the land side, we're proposing a land use planning process so that we can have this agreement with the mining companies and with the Ontario government, that there be land use planning process that would allow all parties to talk about how the land is going to be used, some for conservation, some for industry, and so forth. And that the First Nations are all involved in that. And then there's the planning for the human resources, the economic development side, to create conservation economy in our territory, so that we can actually have monitoring people through this what we have is called Lands Guardians program here in Canada, so that local people are hired to be able to monitor and keep tabs on what's happening on the land, because there's, as we try to protect it from industry, there's also this huge climate change that's going on. There's a melting of the permafrost that's happening, and we see a lot of changes that are coming about because of that. The rivers are running dry, the lakes are running dry, and there's forest fires, galore in the summertime. So we want to be able to monitor the land better, with the resources to be in place. So that's the gist of it, of what it is doing.
That's wonderful. It's a real terrific overview. Okay, now I know that the other panelists each have a different take on some of the same topics that you're talking about. Not so much, of course, the land use, but that you are negotiating with not only people in government, but you have to deal with the opinions of the leaders of the Indigenous communities that you want to represent, right? So I think the real question now to me is how does this happen? What are the areas in which people need to be sensitive to the opinions of people who may have either climate deniers or people who have very limited ideas of what it's appropriate to experiment with in terms of technologies to repair the climate. Suzanne, I believe you've worked along some of these lines in your previous career in government, and I know that Doug Grant has been visiting people at the UN who are representing some of the Indigenous people of other countries, I think this in Scandinavia. So I want to see where we have a common interest in similar concerns. Suzanne, can you comment a little bit on what you've heard so far and how it connects with your own interests and experience?
Well, I think the most encouraging thing about what Lawrence has said is that they have established a voice and an agreement that empowers them really to take action to protect their Indigenous lands. And of course, we have a history worldwide of colonialism that has overtaken Indigenous lands and exploited the resources and the people of those lands. And we are trying to reverse and in some cases compensate for the long-term damage that has been done. But our practices in terms of how we do that and how we engage with the community to really identify their priorities and their needs requires us to essentially white people in power to step back and allow the Indigenous peoples to come forward and establish their own systems and plans for not only recovery, but rebuilding and restoration, and in some cases, restitution. So I'm very encouraged by the agreement that he is in the process of executing with Canada, and hope that it would be a model that we can follow as we work with these other communities to solve the climate action problem. One of the biggest barriers to Indigenous community engagement has been projects, and we're experiencing that right now in California and Alameda, where a bunch of people came in and decided they wanted to do something, but didn't really check it out with the people that live there and invite their input. And now they're facing opposition for that. And I think Doug could probably expand on why he's reached out to the Sami people with respect to an incident that happened with people coming in and wanting to do things without really consulting with the community first. So Doug, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm from California, but right now I'm in Vermont. The image behind me is Quebec during the eclipse. So you were asking earlier, Meta. Yeah, David Keith, who was with, at that time, Harvard, and I think MIT might have been involved as well, wanted to test using a balloon. They wanted to loft a balloon up into the stratosphere, 60 or 70 or 80,000 feet up in the sky, to test whether or not a platform of dispersal of some kind of chalk or sulfur dioxide or sulfuric acid or you name it. But they were going to test how the dispersion happened after the test balloon did its job. And using satellites or some other, I'm not sure how they were going to do it. I don't know the details. But they apparently, Harvard and David Keith apparently got approval from the military, Sweden's military. They didn't talk to the Swedish government. They didn't talk to the Sami. They just went to the military. So when another person whose name I won't mention, but he's also an indigenous here in the U.S., in the Sioux Nation, mentioned to Åsa Larsen Blind, she wrote a letter to the military and I'm not sure who else, that this will not happen. And so she shut down basically that experiment because they were not informed. I want to bring this up. I just read this morning. I've heard it before, but this is the first time I've seen it in writing. Free, prior, and informed consent. Maybe you know what that is, Lawrence. It's a term that basically is saying, from the Sami's perspective, you, Harvard, or anybody else who wants to come and experiment in Sweden or Sami, Sapmi, must give us free, prior, and informed consent. Now, I think I know what that means, but have you heard that term before? Maybe you could explain it better than I can. I'm on the wrong side of this debate. I wouldn't call it a debate. It's just that I'm learning.
Yeah, Lawrence, what do you know about that procedure?
I guess over the years, there's been a number of court cases with First Nations fighting forestry that comes into the territory, or mining companies or hydro dams and whatever else. So through the courts, they've actually started encouraging Canada to create these policies. And that's one of the policies that have been created so that the First Nations will have that opportunity for the FPIC to actually take place. And then there's also, out of the courts came the duty to consult. So that duty to consult has to be made by the government and by the industry when they come into the First Nations area. And then lately, the United Nations have adopted this UNDRIP program, again, to make sure that there's adherence to the First Nations rights when it comes to their territories. And again, they are being not to have a veto of any of these items, but definitely a voice so they can actually speak up and be heard in the proper forum. So
Now that's interesting because you say not a veto. I was assuming that it did mean a veto.
no, governments haven't gone that far yet.
No?
You know, no, nobody has.
Is there a demand for it in the Indigenous communities?
Yeah, definitely. As First Nations gain more voice, Suzanne has said it. There's more talks of First Nations governance to be applied on everything. Even with this conservation thing we're doing, it's the government has agreed through the MOUs for Indigenous-led conservation plans to be presented. This is where, again, how far can we go with that, and what does it really mean? So
okay, now that it already opens another thing. You are trying to negotiate with the government, and would you say that you are an Indigenous plan? I mean, what you're putting forward is an Indigenous plan, or is it? Would you find opposition in the Indigenous communities?
well, in our communities, we are working with 9 communities for this conservation plan.
Mm-hmm.
And each community has what's called their traditional land where they hunt and fish and have inhabited for thousands of years. So we respect those boundaries, and when there's any kind of overlap territories, we have a co-management, co-governance going on with that particular area. So we have these various agreements amongst ourselves. And then on the science part, what we've been doing was gathering traditional ecological knowledge, TEK we call it, but it's oftentimes braided with the science knowledge. So we work with our scientists and our elders together to determine, both sides of the story of a particular plant that grows certain way or certain places, how caribou are supposed to be treated during their migratories, how areas are supposed to be protected, and reasons for it. So we use the science and traditional knowledge to be part of that conservation plan.
Is the Indigenous opinion pretty unified? Or do you find a diversity in debates among these different communities that you visit?
There's in culture, what we find in our culture, it's quite unified. For some reason, somehow, Indigenous culture right across North America is rooted in the same worldview.
Okay.
Okay, the languages are different. We have in Canada, we have 53 different languages here. But we have that common cultural connection amongst each other of how we see ourselves as being part of the world, as opposed to us trying to control the world.
How does that impact on your efforts to your conservation plans, the kinds of interventions that you would make to change the environment and protect the environment?
Well, as Suzanne again mentioned, colonialism has been around for a long time, and depending where you are, which community it is, the ones to the southern parts of our territory that are closest to the cities that are now, I guess, involved and participants in forestry and mining and so forth. So their mindsets are a little bit more different than the ones who in the far north who have not been exposed to that. The ones in the far north are very kin to the land, to live in harmony, to be in harmony, to be part of the earth, so to speak. Whereas to the south, it's more, okay, now we're talking about being able to have conservation and critical mineral strategy go hand in hand, as long as there is participation on how that's going to be carried out. And again, there's the need to incorporate the knowledge in those kinds of discussions. So that's that's the way they've been handling it. And everybody realizes, we all know we all need jobs, and so that's been a compromise to accepting mining and forestry to happen in the territories, but as long as everybody is as participants, equal participants in it. So that's been a bit of a change that's been going on. But even the folks that have these partnership agreements with mining and forestry, they still have that environmental concern to be part of those planning processes. So that's the difference. And when you have those kinds of partnerships, there's certainty that the mining company can enjoy, because they're working in a partnership with First Nations who have given them their consent to go ahead and work in their territory, but work in a partnership setting.
Metta, I thought you were going a different direction. Can I ask a question? Lawrence mentioned being part of nature rather than controlling nature. And your examples include taking from the environment, taking lumber and taking minerals and extraction. So I want to sort of turn that around a little bit and talk about the potential methane release from the tundra when it melts, if it melts, and I'm sure that it will if we don't do something. So we're not extracting anything. We're trying to keep the methane in the tundra, and in the subsea, in this very shallow Arctic Ocean, when that warms up, the methane will come off the ocean floor. So we're not trying to take the methane and use it. We're trying to keep it in the ocean floor, keep it in the tundra. So that would be a form of what some people call geoengineering, or controlling nature, by doing something, for example, what David Keith and Harvard were trying to do, experiment with, is to cast a shadow on an area. It's debatable whether you can confine that to a certain area, but to see what happens when you block the sunlight from the ice and reduce the melting, or eliminate the melting of the ice, so that the Arctic would stay colder, theoretically. Now, this is all theoretical. I'm not advocating. How would the Indigenous people think about taking action to preserve the existing tundra and subsea methane where it is, when there's no extraction involved? There's nobody coming in to take it or make money from it or whatever. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I've actually had some discussion with some of the elders on that. Last year, Metta, when we were talking about this, I did speak to some of the elders about geoengineering that's being thought about, and especially in the Hudson Bay in the Arctic area. And they said, it's something we need to also keep talking about, because the Earth is changing, the Earth is evolving, and we don't really, as humans, have any business to try and change it. Even when you have the melting of the permafrost, and there's new plants that are growing in the areas where the lakes used to be and so forth, those plants are also supposed to mitigate some of that climate change that we're facing, so that the sun continues to warm the place. Yes, there's plants growing, and there's this other carbon that's going to be present, so it's trying to balance itself. But they said, but the humans are still faster at climate change than the Earth itself is able to repair itself. So if you can get people to stop polluting the air, stop with the emissions, that are coming from vehicles and from manufacturing plants and so on, then the Earth will have a chance. But right now, the human race is destroying quicker than the Earth is able to fix itself. So there are debates going on like that, Doug, and it's real. And there's a certain point where they say, well, there's not too much we can do. And then but at the same time, they're also scared of this new technology that's being brought in because it hasn't been proven. It's just all new stuff that everybody wants to try out. You know, if you affect one area, say in the Hudson Bay, James Bay area, with this cooling aspect, what happens to the others someplace else? What impact does it have somewhere else? So the debate is there. Nobody has a right answer, and at the same time, we're watching this climate change happen. And for us, with the permafrost melting, and we see more fires coming into the area, and see all the landslides happening in the rivers themselves sliding. You know, they said this is changing. This is different. And there was a time when the water used to just run right across the land because the ice was right there, closer to the surface. And now it's further down. The water is sinking. That's why we don't have any more raging rivers running like they used to. So people are aware. Definitely, it's a matter of continuing the talks. You know, maybe someday somebody will be convinced that these tests might be safe. Maybe not. Right now, they're not.
Mhm.
I had an interesting conversation.
Yeah,
with,
right now they're just called crazy ideas.
Innovative, crazy idea. I had an interesting conversation with a young lady from Finland, a Sami person, and a couple of weeks ago, and she and I saw really eye to eye that some of these theoretical solutions should be researched and tested cautiously, safely, without doing any damage. And if they work, fine. And if they don't work, then the answer is no. And I think I agree with that. I think we're totally in alignment with that idea. You know, I'm 3 times her age. She's 24 and I'm 76, but we see eye to eye totally on that concept. And also Åsa Larsen Blind, I don't know if you know her, but she was the former president of the Sami Council. Now she's vice president of the Swedish branch of that, has said basically the same thing when on a subsequent interview after she was on a webinar where she said, no, there will be no experimentation. She then told the next interviewer several weeks later that, yeah, we need to research, but we need to be very careful. And I'm paraphrasing what I understood she said, but I can't say absolutely that's what she said. That's what I want to learn. This is my goal, is to find out what are the boundary conditions of testing.
Yeah, and that's part of the conservation plan we have. There's a lot of research to be done. Research on the climate change, research on the impacts of the animals to the waters, to the plants and everything else. Because we see a lot of changes on our food chain too. The snow geese, for instance, used to be abundant in southern James Bay. And now you don't see any of them at all because the eelgrass that they feed on is gone. And so we're talking to Agriculture Canada and saying, is it possible that you guys can help us grow eelgrass in the James Bay again? And will that bring back the snow geese? So yeah, so we're looking to science as well to see if there's going to be any help.
Is it climate that has destroyed the eelgrass or what?
The climate somewhat, there was a number of rivers that were dammed also on the Quebec side. And then there's a number of dams also on the Ontario side. So we feel there's some impact from those dams. And then there's also just the geese themselves, the snow geese, they eat the roots of the eelgrass. So once the roots are gone, the food is gone. So they just keep moving further north, and now they're way up near the Hudson Bay. There's plenty up there, but in the south, they're pretty much gone.
It's kind of like the situation of putting deer on an island and the deer eat all the food and they're left with nothing, so they go extinct.
Yes, yeah, so that's happened.
Suzanne, have you had experience in government about any comparable situation involving negotiations with American Indigenous communities about environmental issues? I know you've worked in government, chief of staff of the legislature in California is a very important role. Tell us a little about your own experience there and what you make of this.
Well, let me say first that I was not chief of staff of the entire legislature. I was chief of staff for a state senator. And I was also her chief of staff when she was in the assembly. So 14 years working essentially on improving public education, social justice, and environmental programs, which those were the focus of the member that I represented, and also took advantage of our areas of expertise. She was a teacher and a school administrator, and active in the community college system. And my background is in environmental sciences, and also my career has been working in energy, transportation, and environment and agriculture. So policy. So all of those obviously touch on Indigenous communities. And one of the first things that we learned, Indigenous and disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. So the first obstacle to engaging them is having a conversation with them. But we have historically, government has relied on the public review process, where they notify you that there's a hearing being held and you can come, or you can review this rather lengthy document and send written comments, and we'll consider your points of view. And it just doesn't work for those communities. That's not how they function. They are more focused on essentially providing for their families. Many of them hold multiple jobs, and they work very hard, and they don't have time, the luxury of, or perhaps the ability to afford travel, or even the access to travel that would enable them to participate in these meetings. So the first thing we did was we established a rule that we go to them. And so we've done, we did a statewide tour of the various communities that were trying to deal with social inequities and the programs that were being successful there, so that we could use them as models and elevate them into the into statewide public policy, and listen to what folks have to say instead of telling them what we already think. So that mindset really made us more attentive to their needs and their priorities. In the legislature, there are environmental justice and social justice organizations that come and lobby for public policy. And one of the things that we found most productive is, rather than seeing everybody one by one, is really encouraging collaboration and exchange of information among those organizations, and also within the groups that maybe oppose whatever policy it is that they want to, that the vulnerable communities are trying to advance. So we found that putting them all in the same room together at the same time so that they can have a conversation is also helpful in terms of generating understanding and learning and coming to some common ground that enables us to move forward. And I think that's what Lawrence is moving into, that phase where they're going to get down to brass tacks. And sometimes there are compromises that need to be made, but these dialogues, excuse me, are really, really important in terms of advancing public policy instead of just advancing, conversation or lip service to some of these needs that need to be addressed. The final thing I was going to say, and again, Lawrence has mentioned, their engagement in auditing and monitoring their properties and the needs that they have there, and the biodiversity of the populations that that live there, et cetera, and really engaging people in the actual process of it's called community science, and really engaging them in the process of figuring out what kind of air pollution is affecting their health, and what kinds of actions are endangering the species. And really that is a good tool also for engaging the youth in the process, and helping them experience some power and influence that we hope will be, a legacy that we can leave within those communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Lawrence?
Yeah, the collaboration is a really important part. Like in the US, we have been working with Ducks Unlimited and the American Wetlands Trust and Audubon Society. And then we have foundations in California that have been funding the feasibility study as well. So collaboration is really important. And that was pointed out earlier when we started these discussions, and that these migratory birds, they fly into the US. You have to partner with the US partners where these birds fly, and so forth. And even South America, there's this red knot bird that flies from James Bay, flies like 5,000 kilometers. It ends up in Chile, in South America, in the southern parts of South America. So there's a need to collaborate amongst all of us to be able to save anything. We want to save birds, any species of birds, we have to do that. The monarch butterflies up here. So we have to work together on making sure that their fly routes are safe, work with the cities, work with all the different organizations. So that's what we've been doing, is touching base with everybody along the route of the goose. And there are many partners that are forming in the science groups in the universities. And we have all of this, what we call a data sharing agreement with all of these members, so that any data that they have, we have a hub that they can actually incorporate their information, and we were able to share what we have gathered and vice versa. So it's a real collaborative effort, across North America. And yes, we have been watching the Samis as well in YouTube, and watching what they're doing with the climate change situations that they're dealing with. We had a guy named Sam Hunter from Pewanak, one of our communities. He went over there to go and learn from them. And he came back all excited about how we can protect our caribou here in Northern Ontario. So some methods that he picked up there. So it's a world collaboration that we're all doing. We only have one planet, so let's all work together and see what we can do.
That's wonderful. The last talk show I did, the last forum, was just a couple of days ago with a guy named Hugh Pope. And our conversation was about the use of citizens' assemblies, which means that you draw by chance, like you get a jury duty. You're just a random selection of citizens from a given area. You draw ordinary people, a cross-section of the population, into participating in meetings that go on for enough length of time to make it possible to have real deliberation. So a group of people might meet for weeks or months, maybe a year, I don't know. In case of, for example, Northern Ireland, where they debated about abortion and about same-sex marriage, I think. They kept it up for a long period of time. But the main thing is, wouldn't it be interesting if somebody would fund this to bring people from the communities, from the indigenous communities in Chile and Norway and in Canada, and all of these places that have common concerns, along with people that they can consult, or scientists, or people who also have points of view or scientific knowledge or whatever, and have an ongoing conversation that would do deliberation about the kinds of recommendations that they could jointly come up with. Has anybody thought of doing that?
Yeah, we talked about that. We were in Mexico last year and we talked about that, about how can we get together. And we have stories that are common in Mexico as we have here about our history and about how our people used to walk down there, I suppose. And we even have a particular language of people that are in Mexico that are also up here in Canada because of people walking, and visiting, trading, or whatever, right? So yeah, definitely is a good idea. But I do have to leave. I have this other meeting I have to attend to right now.
Thank you very much for being with us. It's really good news. Okay, you
All right.
go.
All right. Thank you.
Blessings. to you.
All right. See you again.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye. Okay. So now we are left just with two of us, but we have another 15 minutes or so that we can talk about the interest that you two. I know that you've already been working on some policies together in this organization. Is it in HPAC or which one of these webinar organizations have you participated in? Do you want to share anything about that work?
One of the things that underlies the creation of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition was that there are several groups, each of which has a different focus in the climate change arena. And so Healthy Planet Action Coalition was created as an umbrella organization so that, for instance, Prague, which Doug has been very instrumental in, which has a focus on refreezing the Arctic. Another group is very interested in nature-based solutions. And so it goes on in that way where folks have favored and focused missions, which are appropriate in an organization. Or if you try to spread yourself too thin, you're not going to get anything done. But HPAC was an attempt to create collaboration among those organizations and assist them to find common ground. As organizations go, it's been successful in terms of creating a network. We have over 200 members. We attract guest speakers who are fairly well known in the climate change arena to express their views or present on the work and the research that they're doing, followed by discussion in which our members can participate. But where we have had difficulty is advancing beyond conversation to an implementation strategy. So I think that's where some of the focus has now come, and there is a group that has been formed to come up with a very specific advocacy platform for how to advance this conversation on what we call direct climate cooling, which is basically a euphemism for geoengineering, although we do incorporate nature-based solutions among our list of about 18 different kinds of approaches that one can take to the climate cooling problem. But as Doug pointed out early on in the conversation, what we really need to do, what we're advocating for, is that, first of all, a recognition that the reality is the current policy is not going to work. Emissions reduction alone, even coupled with carbon dioxide removal, are not going to solve the climate crisis, especially in this century, which is sort of what it was promised to do. We also think that the Paris Agreement goals are too high. 1.5 degree limit it to global warming is the damage that's already being done at that level is too great for us to continue to endure. And the public policy makers really need to accept reality and open their minds to other approaches to what we might do. And in order to do that, before we get into the ultimate, which is where everything goes dark because the heat has gotten so high and people are dying in droves, which they're already dying, but people don't seem willing to acknowledge that, is they need to research direct climate cooling opportunities in order not to be backed into implementing something that they don't know as much about as they should, because we're in a crisis predicament. So that's what Healthy Planet Action Coalition does. It's a collaborative organization, and now they're in the throes of trying to really come together with a concrete strategy and specific actions that will have this policy and the need for new policy recognized at the highest levels, including at COP and by the IPCC. So that's where we are with that. Unfortunately, more and more, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, more and more attention is being drawn to the potential for use and need for direct climate cooling because of the extremes that we're experiencing in the weather to date. And the reality is not going to go away. So that hopefully is providing some motivation for to open minds and really have people consider the reality.
Let me ask a more a finer grained question, and that is, it would seem that there would be no difference of opinion on the basic argument that the position should be both all factions within this group of people should probably agree that you want to endorse the idea of doing experimentation right away, that there's this better get on with it. But then now, once you agree on that, are you trying to write a position paper that will define what kinds of experimentation you think should be done first, or what kinds should be done at all? Maybe you're going to rule out some as really not desirable or really too dangerous, or are you really going to stay with the general notion that anybody who's got a good idea should have a chance to try it out, as long as they do it in a way that doesn't cause obvious danger to their neighbors?
We already have position papers that state that. We have the HPAC vision document, which is really needs to be updated because the things that we were saying are serious have become even more serious, and the data supports that. So we need to update the references there. That was written in 2021. We have two papers that are in the process of publication by a number of us who collaborated to write them, discussing each of the measures that seem most likely to offer some opportunity for direct climate cooling. And we started to address the nature of the kinds of approaches that need to take place. For instance, something like marine cloud brightening is actually a methodology that can be applied at a more localized level. And there are projects that are proposed in the Himalayas to address that are very discrete. And part of the process that we recommend is that wherever these more localized pilot projects are concerned, they need to engage the community that would be affected and involve them in the process. And then the final is that there needs to be a governance structure that is monitoring not only the projects in and of themselves, but also has set up some guidelines for how they're conducted, the transparency of them, and at the end of the day, an off-ramp if things start to go south in the experiment, so that it can be safely phased out or discontinued. So we're on record with all that, and probably will be coming out. I think our next step after these two papers are published would be to be even more specific about some particular projects that could go forward. And I know there's an organization which is also part of HPAC, and that's the Rebrighten organization that's focused on marine cloud brightening, and there's some experimentation taking place with respect to the coral reef. So, yeah, I mean, more people are coming on board, but it's it's a tedious process, and we're an unfunded organization. So, what volunteers can do. So we really need some up, courageous public leaders to take the leadership and have this come, before the public bodies for debate, conversation, whatever, and some forward movement.
Well, I think the question in my mind first is how you amplify the credibility of your organization. Let me mention something that I tried to invite two different guests as speakers on one of my programs. I won't give names. One of them was a leading member of your organization or of one of your organizations. There are several webinar organizations similar to HPAC, but this person was a very respected leader in one of those groups. The other one was a man of, I guess, a leading scientist with international recognition. You'd recognize his name if I mentioned it. And when I told them who would be talking to each other in this program, the distinguished famous scientist, said, no, I wouldn't be on a show with anybody from that organization or with this man in particular, because I think he didn't use the word crackpot, but he basically said, I don't want to give legitimacy to these people by appearing on the same show with them. Okay, now that is a real liability if people go around saying things like that and creating that kind of public impression. It means that your statements that you're going to craft so carefully to be wise and sensible are not going to go anywhere because people are going to dismiss you. And I've been in on your conversation, so I know that you're very sensible people and very thoughtful people and very scientifically astute people. You're usually over my head in terms of talking about the science because I don't know enough about chemistry and things. But I know that you're not loony and you're very sensible. So what do you have to do now to counteract that kind of discounting that you're getting from, let's say, mainstream scientists?
I have some thoughts on that.
I'm sorry. I raised my hand a little while ago before Suzanne started talking because I thought I read the question perhaps incorrectly. You said, of course we all agree that we've got to do this, that, and the other thing. And this morning I had a disagreement with the head of an NGO that we all know that NGO, and he disagreed with us that we don't need to cool anything right now. It's not the answer. All we have to do is reduce emissions. And so I responded with, sort of the 30-second elevator speech, and a colleague. We're all part of the same organization, which we were all trained by Al Gore to give his presentations back when it first started. So we're colleagues from way back, but they're like light years behind Suzanne and I. We are on the leading edge, and they're back talking about the cult. Didn't need to use that word, but they're stuck in the mantra of just reduce emissions, and we don't need to cool anything. So this is a hurdle. I'm not going to mention names, but there are.
It's better not to, but it doesn't matter because if you mention one name, somebody else could come up with an example of somebody else who's high prestige, high credibility, but basically wrong. And then now what do you do about it? I think that is the question. What has to happen to move the authority, the credibility from the people who are retarding progress and put it on people who are really more advanced?
somehow we've got to discredit their authority. And one of my thoughts is that if the Sami and the Inuits and the Indigenous Environmental Network with Tom Goldtooth and the Sioux and others, including the small island developing states and AOSIS and the Africans and all in the Australian Aboriginals, all of the indigenous around the world, if they were to come together and demand X, Y, and Z of the remaining COP 196 or 197 nations and say, we are the indigenous, we have the moral authority, I think the Sami
Well, okay,
have moral authority. They're in the
that'd
Arctic.
be lovely, but they're not going to do that because, as we've heard from Lawrence, the people living in the Arctic, for example, in the place that has the most risk going on, are more conservative and more fatalistic, or more willing to say we have to just let nature take its course, and this is, just
I don't think that's firm. I think they all realize they're going to lose, and they're working on it right now. They're going to lose the ocean and the reindeer herding grounds and the polar bears and everything that they have relied on for thousands of years. They are losing it, and they're working on it. The Sami Council has a guy in charge, and they're talking to the University of the Arctic in Tromsø, and there's another one in Sweden and another one in Finland. The Sami are actively working on the problem. It's not new to them. And that's why I've kind of taken the attitude that we just need to present to them some of the information that we have and let them take the lead, because they have the moral authority. Suzanne, what do you think?
Exactly. I mean, and they are. The island nations know that they are literally going to go under. And so they're organizing, they're collaborating, they're getting support. And it's like any movement. I mean, we're all in the age range to have been in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and in the environmental movement, and in the civil rights movement. And movements take time. This one's going to be amplified by the devastation that's being increasingly caused by climate change. So the folks that are in denial, as far as I'm concerned, are not on solid ground, and the facts are going to overwhelm their position statements over time. And so the organization is happening. The UN Assembly, the 79th UN Assembly in New York is going to take up sea level rise, and the organizations of island states are planning to participate heavily in that. So it is working its way up the chain. But if bureaucracy is really hard. Bureaucracy really thwarts change. And so, how we can overcome it and move around it is it's an endemic problem. It always has been, breaking down the silos. So I think we're getting better at it, and we're getting louder, and we're getting bigger in terms of the people that believe this. And the situation is going to really motivate people to act in a unfortunately, hopefully we could plan ahead a little bit instead of having a crisis response, but this isn't going away. And I think we're getting there, not as fast as any of us would like to. But
wow, good. I'm delighted to hear that, because I had a more pessimistic view. Now you've encouraged me to believe that, this isn't, we can expect a lot of progress from the people who are going to be most affected by it, whether it's in the Arctic or the island nations that are going to be submerged, or wherever. So that's a very hopeful point of view, and I want to suddenly accept it. I'll be more optimistic from now on, thanks to you. Time's up. We have to go now, but it's been a really stimulating and useful conversation, and I thank you both very much. Hope to see you again soon. And so
Good to see you, Suzanne.
Good to see you.